The silence in the Iverdale hotel room was not an absence of sound. It was an entity. It pressed down on the air, seeped into the cracks of the sterile white walls, and settled like an invisible dust on every surface. Outside, snow fell without a sound, a white curtain erasing the line between earth and sky. Elena Petrova moved within that silence, each of her movements deliberate, mechanically precise. The dry click as she fastened a metal buckle on her expedition backpack echoed like a breaking bone. Everything was scientifically arranged, a fanatical order to combat the chaos that awaited. She paused, looking at the old-fashioned desk phone. She needed to make one last confirmation call with her guide. When she lifted the receiver, a harsh static shrieked, and for a fleeting second, before the dial tone, she heard something else, a faint, distant whisper, distorted as if a voice were trying to push through an impossible distance. It was wordless, just a mournful sound, and then it was gone. Elena frowned, attributing it to the old wiring. But as she dialed, a sudden biting gust of wind seeped in from the sealed window frame, making the curtain flutter gently. She shivered, feeling as if someone had just breathed on the back of her neck. The phone rang, and a deep, hoarse voice answered on the other end. Dmitri speaking. Dmitri, this is Elena Petrova. I'm just calling to reconfirm our meeting point. At dawn, I know who you are. The voice replied, devoid of pleasantries. So does the mountain. It's sighing tonight. A bad omen. Sighing, Elena asked, trying to maintain a professional tone. That's an interesting way to describe a change. In atmospheric pressure, a long, heavy silence hung on the other end of the line. You will learn that on this mountain, nothing is ever just atmospheric pressure. Scientist, be ready. The line went dead. Liana placed the receiver down, her palm slightly damp. She turned back to the open suitcase on her bed. Inside, nestled between layers of thermal clothing, was an old, yellowed newspaper clipping. She carefully lifted it. It was the article reporting on Professor Afanasyev's fateful expedition. His image, and the memory of the last time she had faced him, rushed back like an old wound. Torn open. The air in the lecture hall was thick. The stage lights were harsh, a space-time parasite. Elena's voice rang out, cold and derisive. Professor, that is the terminology of science fiction, not psychology. Professor Afanasyev looked like a ghost under the lights. You don't understand, Elena. Mansi legends speak of a star that fell like ice, but it didn't melt. It burrowed into the heart of the mountain. It brought with it a hunger that doesn't eat flesh, but fear eats the soul. It's not a demon. It's something entirely alien. She had dismissed it, calling it the delusion of a tired mind. She had used logic to nail him to the cross of superstition, and she had seen the pity in his eyes as he looked at her one last time. Elena blinked, banishing the image. The chill in the room seemed to have deepened. She placed the article down gently, smoothing its folds as if caressing a headstone. Then, with a decisive movement, she closed the suitcase lid. The sound of the zipper echoed in the silent room, a cruel and final incision, severing all hesitation, sealing her fate. The final decision had been made. For a moment after the sound died, Elena stood motionless. The silence was now heavier than before, as if her decisive action had sucked the very air from the room. She did not allow herself to think further. Reason was a shield, but hesitation was the crack in it. She swung the heavy pack onto her shoulders, the straps digging into her collarbones, a tangible weight for the invisible one in her mind. Her hand gripped the suitcase handle, and then she turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance. Dawn in Iverdale didn't bring light, it merely replaced one form of darkness with another. The sky was the color of an old bruise, a purplish gray pressing down on the snow-covered roofs. As Elena stepped outside, the biting cold attacked instantly, sharp as a shard of broken glass. Her breath solidified into a ghostly white cloud before her. Then vanished. The meeting point was an open patch of ground on the edge of town, where the last traces of civilization gave way to the endless wilderness of the Ural Mountains. An old UAZ vehicle, coated in a thin layer of snow, stood like a slumbering beast. Beside it, a small fire burned fitfully, its weak orange light seeming to be swallowed by the surrounding cold. A man stood by the fire. He didn't turn as she approached, as if he had sensed her presence long ago. He was tall, his solid frame wrapped in thick layers of clothing. Only when Elena drew closer did he slowly turn. It was Dmitri's face, looked as though it were carved from rock and wind. High cheekbones, skin weathered by frost, and a thick beard already dusted with snow. But it was his eyes that made Elena hold her breath. They were a dark brown, almost black, and astonishingly deep. They didn't just look at her. They seemed to look through her, into the fears and guilt she had tried so hard to bury. Elena Petrova, he said, his voice as low and gravelly as stones grinding together. It wasn't a question, Dmitri, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She extended a hand, but he merely gave a slight nod, his gaze never leaving hers. Her hand hung in the frigid air for a second before she awkwardly retracted it. She noticed his other hand was clenched around something, a small piece of wood carved into the shape of a sleeping bear, its surface worn smooth from years of being held to break the uncomfortable silence. She began to talk about what she knew. The weather forecast looks stable for the next 2 days. High atmospheric pressure. Those machines don't know how to listen, Dmitri interrupted, his gaze fixed on the fire. They read numbers, but they don't feel the mountain's breath. His hand tightened on the small bear statue. My grandfather was lost up there. He said that before a storm, it holds its breath. The air becomes unnaturally still. That's when you must find shelter. He paused, then turned to look directly at her, his deep eyes a warning. You call it Dyatlov Pass. My people call it by another, named Kholat Syakhl, the mountain of the dead, Elena said softly. I've read about it. Reading is not understanding, Dmitri replied. Legend says that 9 of our shamans were killed there by an evil spirit long ago. The number 9 is an unlucky number on this mountain. He said it calmly, as if discussing the weather, and that very calmness made his words 100 times more terrifying. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine. She tried to armor herself with reason, an interesting piece of folklore. It demonstrates humanity's primal fear of nature. Dmitri looked at her for a long time, a look so perceptive it was almost pitying. He didn't argue, he only said one last thing, his voice dropping to a whisper that was nearly carried away by the wind. Respect its silence, scientists, because when it starts to speak, you won't want to listen. With that, he took a snow shovel and decisively tossed a large pile of snow onto the fire. The flames hissed one final protest and died. A thick plume of white smoke rose, twisting in the air for a second like a released spirit, then vanished. Without another word, Dmitri turned, his pack on his shoulders, and began to walk toward the edge of the forest, where the trail leading up the mountain awaited. Lena stood frozen for a second, the cold seeming to solidify her very thoughts. The white smoke from the fire had dissipated, taking the last bit of warmth with it. Now there was only her and the hostile silence of the wilderness. The silence and the receding back of Dmitri. A small, cold panic rose in her chest. To be left here was to die. She hastily shouldered her pack, cinched the straps, and nearly ran after him. The sound of her boots crunching desperately on the snow. They entered the forest. Immediately, the world changed. The grey light of dawn was swallowed by the dense pine canopy, leaving only weak, hazy shafts of light filtering through. The air became unnaturally still. The thick snow underfoot not only muffled their footsteps, but seemed to absorb all other sounds. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling through the needles. There was only the sound of her own heavy breathing, and the steady, relentless crunch of Dmitri's steps ahead. The trees here were bizarrely twisted, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers, forming a dark canopy. Snow on the branches created grotesque shapes. One branch looked like an outstretched arm. A snow-covered stump resembled a face screaming in silence. Elena tried to dismiss these thoughts, telling herself it was just pareidolia, the psychological tendency to find familiar patterns in random images. But her reason, once a fortress, now felt like a fragile house of paper. After several hours of walking in near torturous silence, Dmitri suddenly raised his hand, a sharp gesture to halt. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on a small clearing. Ahead, Elena moved closer, her heart beginning to pound faster, and then she saw it in the middle of a field of pristine, untouched snow, was a perfect circle. It wasn't drawn, it was formed from footprints. Many footprints. They were the prints of bare feet, impossibly deep in the hard-packed, rock-solid snow. 9 sets of footprints, she counted unconsciously. They didn't lead into or out of the circle. They were simply there, walking around in a chillingly precise orbit, like dancers in some mad, endless ritual.